video today about diagnosing and replacing an idler pulley on your engine. If you open your trunk to look at your engine and you realize there's no engine there, probably be a good idea to stop and take your car somewhere where they know what they're doing, because your engine's more than likely in the front, however mine's in the back, so we're going to be working back here. It's really a fairly simple job. You just need a couple of tools, socket set, maybe some wrenches, and a torque wrench if you have it. You can also rent those for free at AutoZone. Now the first thing you'll notice if you have a pulley going bad is kind of like a whining or a screeching sound. It'll probably start when it's cold outside and typically go away once the car warms up, but it'll progressively get worse. And it's actually a really easy thing to diagnose. So the first thing I recommend doing once you find your accessory belt is take a few pictures of it. You can also find diagrams online, but it's easier if you just have a few pictures as reference for how everything goes back together. Now the actual orientation and kind of route the belt takes is going to be engine specific, not just car specific. So if you have a model car that came with a few engine options, make sure you look up the right one if you're looking for replacement parts or a diagram. And on most modern cars, you'll have what's called a tensioning pulley, and that is this one on the 911. And essentially you just put a socket on that and you can turn it and it just kind of rotates this entire thing inward to take the tension off the belt, and then you can just slip it off the belt and it's much easier to work with. A lot of older cars had a like a bolt that you would turn to tighten it, and you had to tighten it manually, and it was kind of a pain and a terrible design. This is a much better design. So once you find the accessory belt, you want to familiarize yourself with it and kind of look it over and identify the different components. On a typical vehicle, belt-driven accessories are going to include an alternator. So on this particular car, it's right here. You can identify the alternator because it has little slots in it, and you can see some copper wire wound up. There will be an air conditioning compressor. So it usually kind of has a big pulley. This is the air conditioning compressor here. Another giveaway are black hoses running to it. You can see there's two black hoses running to this one. You'll have a power steering pump. Again, a big pulley. Typically has some kind of a reservoir attached to it. So here it is on this particular car. Water pump. In this car, it is down there in the lower corner. It can usually be identified by a coolant hose running to or from it. And there's the actual crank pulley, which is kind of probably going to be the biggest one, and it's usually centered. So this is it here. And then everything else on this vehicle is just like a deflector pulley. So these two are just deflector pulleys that change the angle of the belt around the other pulleys, and then a tensioning pulley. So in this particular case, I've identified that the top deflector pulley, the bearings inside of it are bad. Although I suspect that the pulley on the alternator, which is actually called an overrun pulley, is also bad, and I will explain that in a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and take the belt off, and then I'll show you how to tell which pulleys are bad. All right, so to remove the belt, I put in this case, a 15/16 socket on the tensioner pulley. And I'm going to attach a breaker bar, and then just kind of lightly turn it and see which way actually causes it to release the tension on the belt. You can see if I'm turning it clockwise, it's releasing the tension. So I'm going to go ahead and release the tension and then just slip the belt straight off of that pulley. It might get hung up on the grooves of another pulley like this. Just kind of work it off, and then you can let the tension back off of it, and it'll actually travel further now that it doesn't have the belt on it, so anticipate that. So there are actually a few methods for diagnosing and identifying the troublesome pulley, and depending on what pulley it is and the situation, you may have to use one or the other or both. One way is to use an automotive stethoscope like this. It's not my favorite way to do it because you have to put it down and touch the accessories as the engine's running, which is potentially dangerous with the belt spinning around. The other way, and what I'm about to show you, has worked 100% of the time with idler pulleys for me, and it's super easy to do. So I'll go ahead and show you how to do it. and that is just to spin the pulley when the belt is off of it. So we've taken the accessory belt off, and you can see here I'm going to go ahead and spin this top one. And I'm not sure if you can hear that, but it's kind of got like a little bit of a grinding noise. And it's spinning quite a bit. Now I'm going to spin the one below it. And you notice how it pretty much stops immediately. Completely different noise. This one's more like a rattling. Whereas this one is kind of a smooth, it just kind of stops. That is what you want. A good pulley, a brand new pulley, is just going to spin maybe 1 or 2 turns and pretty much stop immediately. When they start to go bad and the bearings wear out, they spin much, much more, kind of like a skateboard wheel. We can go ahead and check this idler pulley while we're at it. Again, spin it and it basically just stops. That's what you want to see. That's what you want to see. That's not what you want to see. So this one is in need of replacement. Now I mentioned earlier that I also suspect the overrun pulley. Yeah, I'm hearing a little bit of a squeak on this one. So, and by the way, this test applies to these deflector pulleys or idler pulleys, not accessory pulleys, because some of these, like for example, the air conditioning compressor actually has an electromagnetic clutch. So when the car's off or the AC isn't running, this will spin freely because the center section isn't engaged. And it's just, you can still kind of do a spin test, but the rules won't necessarily apply as hard fast as with these guys. These guys, if it spins like that and it's rattling, it's no good. Now I mentioned earlier, I suspect my alternator pulley might be bad as well. Now this particular pulley is different. It's actually called an overrun pulley, and it's designed so that if you wind the car way up in the RPM range and get this spinning really fast and then let off the gas immediately, it doesn't stop this. This has like kind of a, almost like a sprocket on a bicycle, how it can continue spinning faster than the accessory belt and slowly like drop back down to the same speed. So the other day when I started it up and I heard a whining after I shut it off, I came back here, this was actually still making a little bit of a whine after the engine had been turned off, meaning the overrun pulley was still spinning, and because I could hear it and nothing else, that led me to believe that it has an issue. But let's go ahead and replace this pulley. This should be pretty straightforward. So we're going to find a socket to fit this nut. I've already ordered a replacement part from Pelican Parts, so this should be pretty straightforward. All right, so this particular bolt is a 15 millimeter. I already have the socket on there. So I'm going to go ahead and see how easy it is to break loose. So, kind of a strange angle with the deck lid in the way. There we go. There we go. It is kind of a strange angle, especially with this oil filler pipe in your way. Oh wow. So this bolt is actually part of goes to the alternator bracket as well. So it's a long bolt. Looks like we have the bolt, there's a washer on the front, and there's a spacer on the back. So just kind of take note of the orientation of anything like that when you take it off, so when you put it back together, you don't have any issues. Okay, and the spacer, fit inside of the bearing like that. And you can see this guy is just spinning and spinning and spinning like a skateboard wheel. Whereas the new one here, again, you spin it, it just stops. That's the difference between a good bearing and a bad bearing. And when I say bearing, I'm talking about there's an actually a bearing inside of the pulley itself. So the pulley is just a piece of metal. It's the bearing on the inside that actually goes bad over time. So you can see a little bit of corrosion on that one, but pretty easy to remove. So we'll put the new one in there. After a bit more research, a couple things. One, I read that this bolt actually came with a thread locker from the factory and that you should add a little bit of blue Loctite to it before reinstalling. So I took it out and I'm going to add a little bit of blue Loctite to it. The second thing I noticed, I mentioned earlier that I saw torque values of 17 foot-pounds, 34 foot-pounds, and 48 foot-pounds. It was dependent on the bolt size. And although I haven't found like a conclusive, hey, this is the torque spec for the top deflector pulley, I did notice the bottom deflector pulley has a much smaller bolt. So I'm going under the assumption that the bottom one has the lower torque value, the top one has the higher torque value. So I'm going to go 34 foot-pounds on the top one with a little bit of blue Loctite. I made a post on the forums, so hopefully somebody will be able to clarify it and I can always come back and adjust if needed, but I'm pretty confident that 34 will be fine. Another reason I feel that's the case is because when I did remove this just now to install the Loctite, it broke loose a lot easier than initially. So that leads me to believe that it was torqued to a higher value earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. There we go. So the bolt is now torqued down. I added some Loctite. The next step is just to put the accessory belt back on, and I'm probably going to have to reference those pictures that I mentioned taking earlier just to be sure that I get it all back together correctly. The trickiest part of this on this particular vehicle is the water pump pulley because it's kind of down there out of reach. So I like to start off by making sure that one is on there and seated properly. So my general approach to this is to get the belt pretty much routed exactly the way it should go, with the exception of this last pulley. Which actually what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to leave the belt off this top idler pulley and get it around even the tensioner pulley if I can. Might not be able to. You'll have to bear with me for a second because I've only done this like 2 or 3 times on this particular vehicle. Okay, so what I've done here, because it's going to be easier to work with it, especially since the wrench is going to have to be on this tensioner pulley, make sure it's seated in the little grooves on the accessory pulleys. So I have it routed and seated properly everywhere except for this pulley, just because this one happens to be smooth, doesn't have ridges, as at the top it's easier to access. So now what you can do is take the tension out of it. And it would be nice to have a third hand in this case, but go ahead and get it settle on there, and then also just double check anywhere there's a little grooves that the belt is seated properly. And then once it's on there, release the pressure or add the pressure back, depending on how you think about it. So again, just kind of look over all the spots where the belt goes around pulleys and make sure it's seated, it's not hanging off an edge. That looks good. So that's actually surprisingly easy to do. So in this case, we're all back together. The last step is just to reinstall the airbox on this particular vehicle. And we're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in and we'll start it up and see what happens. To sum things up, to do this project, I used a 15/16 half-inch drive socket with a 24-inch breaker bar. Maybe it's 18-inch breaker bar, doesn't matter. A torque wrench with a 15mm socket and a 3/8 drive ratchet. Blue Loctite, replacement pulley and bearing. So this is the original one. As I mentioned earlier, I got the replacement from Pelican Parts. Here is the part number for it. And again, this was the top deflector roller idler pulley. The bottom one looks very similar, but it's different, so make sure you order the right part. And then I used a few miscellaneous tools like a screwdriver and a Torx bit to remove my airbox, but I don't have a factory airbox, so that shouldn't impact you.